I'm an associate professor of psychology at Colorado State University. My area of specialty is in the area of social psychology, and my primary research area is on the focus of family violence, in particular, parental alienation.
I'm a child psychiatrist and a forensic psychiatrist. I was on the faculty at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine for 20 years, but now I am a professor emeritus in the Department of Psychiatry at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine.
I was first a family counselor as a licensed clinical social worker for 12 years. Then I became a family lawyer, which I've been for the last 28 years, a family law specialist in California. My area of expertise really is high conflict personalities, high conflict divorce cases, and a lot of the dynamics that go into that.
I'm Dr. Lynn Steinberg. I've been a psychotherapist for 47 years. I've worked primarily with adolescents, children, and adults and families. For the last 13 years, I've been specializing in working in parental alienation. I do expert witnessing, teaching the courts about parental alienation, and I do a 4-day reunification with families.
I consider parental alienation to be a mental disorder or a mental condition of a child, of children. And these are children who typically whose parents are engaged in a divorce or separation, a high conflict divorce, and the child attaches firmly to one parent and gravitates away from the second parent. And this is without a good reason.
Parental alienation is an outcome in a child that is a result of a family dynamic where one parent has influenced a child to feel as if the other parent never loved them, abandoned them, and that they're unsafe, even though those are not true. So this is an unjustified rejection that a child has. It's a reaction that they have to the parent that is not anything that the other parent has done.
I remember a case I had in court where the child had said that I don't like the way dad wears his hair, so I never want to see him again. He embarrasses me at school, and the judge said, well, sir, why don't you just cut your hair?
A practitioner who doesn't know about parental alienation and isn't familiar with it isn't aware of what they don't know about. In other words, that they don't know what they're missing. And that's what I would mean by naive, that not only are they not aware of the phenomenon of parental alienation, but they're not aware that they don't know about it.
Well, he totally missed the point, and I would say therapists often do that too. They don't realize this is a pattern, this is many behaviors building up to this point. It's 1,000 little bricks of alienating behavior that build this wall. And therapists often just don't see it because they haven't been trained in this. It's counterintuitive.
So the kind of symptoms one might see in working with a child, for example, they might say, I'm so close to my mom and I never want to see my father. I hate going over to see my father. A untrained therapist might say, oh, she's very bonded to her mother and she really doesn't get along with her father very well. And she feels afraid of her father and just doesn't want to see him. And I support the child not going over to see her father. So there are some counterintuitive things about PA that the therapist didn't pick up on.
It's counterintuitive because mental health practitioners tend to have an overlay of viewing problems. So one overlay is that in families, everybody's an equal contributor, and therefore, if there's a problem, everyone's contributed to it.
Well, a lot of times mental health providers are trained to validate feelings. A client comes to their office, they're trained to listen to what they have to say, validate what they have to say, hear that this is from their perspective, that to make them feel safe and build a rapport. Unfortunately, if you have a child who comes to therapy and they've been alienated and they believe all sorts of things that never happened or were exaggerated, the therapist could inadvertently reinforce those and make the child start to firmly believe that it actually did happen.
They could further the alienation. They could make the alienation worse by encouraging a child to, for example, speak out and be very disrespectful.
And this creates what we call a corruption of reality, where the child's lived experience with a parent doesn't match this new narrative. And therapists can inadvertently make it worse by validating beliefs that and stories about things that hadn't happened.
They become over-empowered. They suffer from self-esteem, very often substance abuse and eating disorders, depressed, not be able to get along very well with others, poor relationships with parents, with lovers, and also a lot of suicidal ideation.
When children are manipulated and weaponized against the other parent, which is what these children have been created into weapons to be used against the other parent, to hurt them and manipulate the other parent, that weaponization of the child has very serious long-term consequences, because essentially the child becomes party to the abuse.
Another overlay is abuse and child abuse. And so if a parent says, well, the other parent is abusing the child, then that becomes the framework that the therapist uses to understand the case without realizing that there may be a hidden dynamic here, and rather than abusing the child, the person who's saying the other parent's doing that may actually be influencing the child, often even unconsciously, through their words, through their emotions, and their behavior. So you have to have at least 3 theories as a therapist of what's going on in a case, and most therapists don't look at things that way.
One strategy that alienating parents use is use of third parties, meaning that they will use therapists, they'll use child protection workers, they'll use police, they'll use teachers, anyone that they can to help them alienate the other parent. So it provides them additional strength, like a coalition against another parent. I've seen parents turn churches, entire church congregations against a parent. But therapists are used a lot, or doctors are used frequently, because they're mandatory reporters, and they can often get the children to go and say things that then they have to report. And so it makes then the alienating parent look like they didn't do anything and deny responsibility for their role in the alienation. And they can often, and a lot of times, alienating parents are very manipulative and very persuasive, and they can fool a lot of mental health providers into believing their side of the story.
The therapist may misinterpret the alienating parent's characteristics as being very charming, very calm, and misinterpret the alienated parent's characteristics by saying that they're hysterical, they seem to be borderline personality disorder, and they align themselves with the parent that's cool, calm, and collected, whereas that's probably the narcissistic parent in parent alienation. So I also think that therapists, when they are trained in family systems therapy, they tend to be pretty lazy about it, and they develop a very eclectic approach. They could look a little bit deeper and find out that there are some things in family systems theory and family systems structured therapy, and find that they could maybe work with alienated parents and children from that perspective. But I think they're pretty resistant to understanding that this requires a whole new approach. And they like to use their old approach, I guess, is what it is, but it doesn't work. So why continue to use it? And the custody evaluators, like the therapists, and usually they are therapists, will make the same mistake in terms of the symptomology. It's what you see is not what you get in parental alienation. The dynamics are counterintuitive. So you have to be careful to understand that and see what's really happening with the child. So for example, I think a real red flag is when the children do not want to have contact with the other parent and maybe aren't having contact with the other parent at all.
Now, in terms of how many children it affects, we find it's about 3 to 4 million children are moderately to severely alienated from a parent. And it seems, that is a lot of children, and that is actually an underestimation. So parental alienating behaviors are the same as coercively controlling violence.
We need to have much more education, both in the formal education in graduate school of psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers and nurse practitioners, but we also have to have continuing education for these individuals as they progress through their careers.